Ryan accepted the offer on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, his third day, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not wrong enough to name or explain to anyone, just a quiet, persistent feeling that the company he'd interviewed with and the company he'd actually joined was somehow not the same place. He told himself it was new job nerves. Adjustment period. Everyone feels this way at the beginning. He was partially right, but he was also missing something that would cost him 7 months of his career. Here's what almost nobody tells you before you start a new job. The onboarding period isn't just orientation. It's one of the most psychologically revealing windows you will ever have into how a company actually functions, not how it presented itself in the interview, but how it actually operates when it thinks no one is paying close attention. And most people spend that entire window either too nervous or too hopeful to see what's clearly in front of them. Ryan almost did, until he started noticing the wrong things were being said. The first red flag appeared on day 1. Ryan's manager, a man named Trevor, spent the first 40 minutes of the morning explaining the history of the department, who had held which role, why certain projects had failed in the past, and why the previous person in Ryan's position just wasn't the right fit. The phrase was mentioned twice. The previous person's departure was described in enough detail that Ryan had a fairly complete picture of what went wrong, from Trevor's perspective, within the first hour of his employment. This felt like transparency. It wasn't. Here's what's actually happening when a manager over-explains a predecessor's failure during onboarding. They're not giving you context. They're setting a frame. Because the moment you understand exactly what went wrong with the last person, you begin, unconsciously, calibrating your own behavior to avoid those specific failure patterns. Which means you're not being brought in to do the job as yourself. You're being brought in to be the corrective opposite of whoever just left. That's a fundamentally different thing, and it almost never ends the way the new hire expects. The second red flag appeared on day 3. Ryan was introduced to his team. There were 7 people. 3 of them had been in their roles for less than a year. 1 had been there for 6 weeks. He didn't think much of it. Companies grow. Roles expand. Turnover happens. Then he mentioned it casually to an HR coordinator during onboarding paperwork, and her response told him everything. She said, without elaborating, "Yeah, this team has gone through some transitions." She moved on immediately. No explanation offered. No opening created. When the person responsible for explaining the company to you avoids the most obvious question in the room, the absence of information is itself information. High turnover on a team isn't just an HR metric. It's a transmission from every person who left before you, telling you something about the environment that the job description and the interview process were specifically designed not to say. The third red flag appeared at the end of week 1. Ryan attended a team meeting where a specific project was discussed. He had been told during the interview that this project, a client expansion initiative, was one of his primary responsibilities. He'd even asked detailed questions about it during the second interview and received detailed answers. In the meeting, that project wasn't discussed at all. Afterward, Ryan asked Trevor about it directly. Trevor said something that Ryan replayed for weeks afterward. "Oh, that's sort of in a holding pattern right now. We can circle back." Circle back. Here's what circle back means inside an organization when applied to something that was supposed to be your core responsibility. It almost never means later. It usually means we don't fully own this decision yet, or the budget is less certain than we implied, or the project has political complications we didn't want you to see before you signed. When the scope of the role you were hired for begins shrinking within your first 2 weeks, that contraction rarely reverses. More often, it reveals the distance between the position that was advertised and the position that actually exists. But nobody told Ryan the fourth red flag was the most dangerous one. 3 weeks in, Ryan noticed that whenever he asked questions, particularly about process or about why things were done a specific way, the answers followed a pattern. The answers were always, "That's just how we've always done it." Not, "That's our current best approach and here's why." Not, "Great question, let's look at that." Just, "That's how we've always done it." Here's what that answer reveals about an organization's health that most people never consciously register. It tells you that institutional memory has replaced institutional thinking. It tells you that the people who could explain why things are done this way have already left, and what remains is a collection of habits that no one can fully defend, only inherit. An organization that cannot explain its own processes has a specific kind of internal problem, and it tends to solve that problem by resisting the people who ask questions, rather than rewarding them. The fifth red flag arrived on day 22, during what Ryan had assumed was a standard one-on-one with Trevor. Except the meeting wasn't a one-on-one. When Ryan arrived, an HR representative he'd never met was also in the room. Trevor introduced her by name and said this was just a standard check-in we do with new hires. Ryan said it felt fine, went through the usual questions. That evening he mentioned it to a colleague he'd started to trust, someone who'd been at the company for 3 years. The colleague paused before answering, then said, very quietly, they've never done a 3-week check-in with anyone else I've seen come through here. Here's what an unannounced HR presence in an early performance conversation usually signals, even when no one in the room acknowledges it directly. It means someone has already raised a concern, not about Ryan's performance, he'd barely been there, but perhaps about the previous person in this role, about a pattern that keeps repeating, about a situation the company has decided, probably after some kind of internal review, it wants documented from the beginning this time. Ryan wasn't in trouble. He was being positioned as documentation, without anyone telling him that was what was happening. The 6th red flag appeared in week 5, and it was the quietest one. Ryan sent his first project update to Trevor. He'd put real work into it. Not just the deliverable itself, but the context, the framing, the reasoning behind his decisions. He wanted Trevor to understand not just what he'd done, but how he thought. 3 days passed. No response. Not a short one. Not a got it, thanks. Nothing. On day 4, Trevor mentioned the project in a meeting as if he'd reviewed it, but in a way that suggested he'd only skimmed the surface. Ryan asked afterward if Trevor had seen his notes. Trevor said yes. The notes had taken Ryan 6 hours. Here's what silence from a manager after real work represents, and it's one of the most underrated warning signs in any professional relationship. It tells you that your output is being consumed without being witnessed, that the person responsible for your development has decided, consciously or not, that you don't require investment, that the relationship will be extractive rather than developmental. And an extractive managerial relationship is one of the clearest predictors of a ceiling. Not a performance ceiling. An acknowledgement ceiling. The point beyond which no amount of effort gets seen, because no one above you is looking. Ryan stayed for 7 months. In month 4, he learned from a LinkedIn search that Trevor had been in his role for only 14 months himself. The manager before Trevor had lasted 9. In month 6, the client expansion project was formally cancelled and absorbed into another team entirely. In month 7, Ryan left. Not dramatically. He found something better, took it, gave 2 weeks' notice, and moved on. In his exit interview, when HR asked why he was leaving, he gave the professional answer. He said it was a good opportunity that aligned with his goals. What he didn't say was that all 6 of the signs had been there in the first 5 weeks, and he'd had every tool he needed to read them. He'd just been too new, too hopeful, and too willing to rationalize each one individually instead of reading them as a system. Here's the realization I want you to sit with. Onboarding red flags are almost never dramatic. Companies don't show you their dysfunction through confrontations or obvious failures. They show you through patterns, small ones, each of which has a plausible individual explanation but a clear collective meaning when read together. The predecessor over-explained. The team has unusual turnover. A responsibility shrank without warning. Processes can't be justified. An HR presence appeared without context. Effort went unacknowledged. Any one of these, alone, might be nothing. Together, they form a profile of an organization telling you, in its behavior, something it would never say in its job description. The employees who navigate their careers most effectively aren't necessarily the ones who always choose correctly. They're the ones who learn to read the onboarding period for what it actually is, not the beginning of a relationship, but the organization's first honest conversation with you, delivered entirely in behavior rather than words. And the moment you know how to read that conversation, you stop losing 7 months at a time. I'm Alex. And this is exactly how the system works. If any of these 6 signs felt familiar, you already know what to do next. Subscribe.